I'm Sarah Lowther and welcome to this Focus IR interview with an industry leader. Today we're talking about the increasing global demand for electric vehicles and energy storage and the market participants involved in the sector. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by GreenRoc Mining Chief Executive Stefan Bernstein. So Stefan, before we take a deeper dive into the sector and to put your presence into context, what is it that GreenRoc Mining is developing?
Yeah, so GreenRoc Mining is a critical raw materials company, and what our business is that we are developing a graphite deposit, a world-class graphite deposit in southern Greenland to production and to provide the electric car industry with quality graphite anode material, because graphite is a key component in the electric car batteries.
So that's a lot of responsibility. When we look at the wider picture, Stefan, how great is the sense of urgency where the market is concerned? You know, what is the current supply deficit, and who needs these critical minerals and metals?
So across the commodities, going from graphite to cobalt to copper to lithium, of course, which are all very important components in the electric vehicle batteries. I would say that some of them are more critical than others, in the sense that there's already a deep market for copper, for instance, whereas for cobalt and particularly lithium, and certainly also graphite, there has been a market, up to a few years ago, but now it's really taking off because the demand is going to, outstrip supplies in the years to come several times. So if we just take a look at, like, for instance, graphite, we had a yearly production across all applications back in 2020 of about 1 million tons worldwide. And the need for graphite just for batteries, for EV batteries, is in this year of 1 million tons. And in 10 years' time, it's going to go up 4 times to more than 4 million tons of graphite. And similarly, we can see the same kind of development for lithium and cobalt and some other of the critical raw materials. And where we're going to source them, that's a really good question. Benchmark Mineral Intelligence have forecasted that by 2035, to supply the needs from the energy transition, we'll need about 100 new mines of lithium and about 100 new mines of graphite, just as examples of the average size of graphite mines. So enormous needs, and we can't really depend on just seeing all of this being supplied from some unknown place on this planet, as we in the Western world have kind of become used to, that the raw materials are just there at our demand. It's not going to be like that in the future.
You've just outlined some eye-watering statistics there. So let's circle back to the situation now. I'm just wondering, what are the dominating EV battery technologies on the market today? On what role does graphite play?
Yeah, so it is today's lithium-ion batteries that are the main technology, and there are 2 types of batteries. There's the NMC batteries, which stands for nickel, manganese, and cobalt. And those are the technology of choice for most of the electric vehicles we see on the streets today in Europe and the United States. There's another technology called LFP batteries, which is, again, a lithium battery, but it uses phosphorus and iron. It's more light and it's less costly to produce, but it's also having a lower capacity. Those are the 2 leading technologies, and I think forecast shows that the LFP batteries are going to take over in the future, because many consumers only drive, a few tens of kilometers every day anyway. So you don't need to have like 400 or 500 miles capacity in your car. But common to these two technologies is that they use graphite. More than 20% of the batteries raw materials is consists of graphite. I should also mention there's another technology that is being developed now, which is solid state batteries. They don't use graphite as anode material, and they are forecasted to have a market share of about 10% or so in 10 years' time.
So what about the circular economy? I'm just wondering, can recycling of batteries help meet some of the future demand for raw materials and for graphite specifically?
Yes, very good question. And I think it's also some of the promises that are out there that, in the future, some of our demands for raw materials in general can be supplied or met by recycling materials. And for instance, for copper, for a long time, copper has actually had a very high degree of reuse. So thereby we can minimize the amount that we need to haul out of the ground. For the car batteries, which is of course going to be an enormous amount of critical raw materials when you consider how many millions and millions of cars there are on the streets today that need to be replaced in the coming years with electric cars. So, and the batteries from there, you can say that there are two main complications to recycling the raw materials. First of all, in the coming years, there won't be any batteries to recycle because an expected lifetime for an EV battery is maybe 10, 15 years. So cars that are being built today, of course, won't go back into recycling until, 10 years from now, or even longer. The other thing to say is that the number of electric cars that are being built in the coming years are so many more times those that are already now driving around, so there won't be the volume to recycle until many years from now. But having said that, there's a high degree of potential to recycle raw materials from these batteries, particularly in terms of like the metals, nickel, cobalt, copper, lithium, and manganese. For graphite, the situation is different because graphite is not just measured in terms of its purity, it's also measured, there are some physical properties. The graphite is processed into what's called spherical graphite and purified spherical graphite. That's what makes up the anodes. And by recycling, you cannot recover material with the same specifications and that meets the strict requirements for the battery industry. So you can probably recycle the graphite, but not for batteries. You can use it for the steel industry and other. So that means that the demand for graphite is going to remain high in the years to come.
Okay, so GreenRoc is perfectly positioned for that, or definitely positioning itself for that. But Stefan, Europe now, to what degree can Europe supply its own demand of critical raw materials? I'm wondering about the challenges and solutions for scaling up production here in Europe.
And you are saying scaling up production. In a few instances, with a few examples, we actually do have mining in Europe. But for a lot of the raw materials, it's not about scaling up. It's about having a production altogether. So even though there's been mining in Europe for thousands of years, of course, over the past, let's say 50 years, we've been basically outsourcing most of the raw materials sourcing to other countries. And to the degree that there are only a few places left in Europe with a substantial mining today, which is like Spain with copper and nickel, and there's also Poland with copper, and certainly the Scandinavian countries. But I'd say that from a geological point of view, there's a lot of potential in Europe. And so we could potentially supply a lot more of the raw materials needs that we have. Presently, I think we are producing less than 5% of the demand, while we are using more than 25% of world's production of raw materials here in Europe. So, and it's also about securing the supply chains, obviously. And also, I think, so from a geological point of view, we could supply more by ourselves. And I'd say also that it's probably, you could certainly make the argument that it's also wanted, because in Europe, we usually have a much better and more strict regulations in terms of like the social and environmental impacts. So mining in Europe would actually be more responsible, in general terms at least, than mining in many other places on this planet.
Is there a critical minerals policy in Europe? Does a regulatory framework exist that is workable and not punitive to companies working in this space?
It's a bit complicated, of course, because we have so many different countries, each with their own legislations and regulations. But there is certainly a strong wish from the European countries, and particularly from the EU, to have a higher degree of domestic supply of these raw materials. So, for instance, the European Commission proposed a Critical Raw Materials Act in March, asking that we have at least 10% of the raw materials needs to be supplied from Europe itself, and more than 40% of the processing should also take place in Europe. And that proposal passed with an overwhelming majority in the European Parliament here in September. It's going to be probably final agreed on in December. And there are several ways that they will support so-called strategic projects, which are projects that are within the that are aiming at producing some of the strategic raw materials. They will be supplying support. The EU Commission will make instruments available that can supply finances, but certainly also help out with the permitting and granting process. Presently, coming back to your question, sorry, you could say that presently there's not a common initiative to make the permitting and granting processes more smooth and more fluent. But I think that will have to change if we are to become more self-reliant on raw materials in the European countries.
Okay, but universally, Stefan, there is ESG, very, very important. Will higher ESG credentials for raw materials allow a price premium?
I think that the answer to that is that it will likely be so, because what we're seeing today is across many other businesses that you can see the consumers are demanding higher ESG credentials. As an example, I could just mention, for instance, organic farming, which 10, 15, 20 years ago was negligible in many countries, which is now actually taking a higher and higher market share, even though the prices are higher. And I think you can also see several of the higher end consumer electronics and also electric cars are starting to market themselves with high ESG credentials as being a parameter. So I think it's inevitable that we in the future will see a tendency, at least, to put more emphasis on aspects of the sourcing of your raw materials. And I think this whole agenda with the energy transition, and also the way that people are, well, speaking about the needs for the raw materials, certainly raises the awareness of the way that our modern society depends on raw materials, and therefore you suddenly start to wonder also about where they're actually being sourced naturally. A few years back, as I mentioned in the beginning here, people thought that they were but just like miraculously. We all, we're just surrounding ourselves with raw materials without really thinking about where they're coming from.
So finally, Stefan, there's lots for us to consider there, but you were at the recent European Battery Raw Materials Conference, and I think Amsterdam. Did you leave that conference feeling optimistic about the future of the industry, that there is cohesion, or do you feel that GreenRoc is somehow or somewhat alone in its endeavours?
We're definitely not alone. That's for sure. I don't. It's hard to see there's any like coherent movement or policy or anything, but there's a lot of initiatives and certainly a lot of interest. I think for us as a coming graphite producer, I'd like to see a little bit more concern about how this very, very important anode material is going to be sourced in the future, because lithium has been running with all the attention for a while now, because the prices have gone berserk, of course. So, but I think that in general, there's these conferences and across news in the newspapers and other media. I think there's certainly a growing, as I say, awareness of the raw materials needs, and also in the policy you can see changes that I wouldn't have dreamt of a few years back. So things are moving, and we don't feel alone at all.
Stefan Bernstein, thank you very much indeed, the Chief Executive of GreenRoc Mining. Thank you.